This conference will now be recorded.
Okay. First of all, I'd like to welcome everybody to this pre-conference workshop for CAM. This is the data maintainer training for 2020 for the Kansas NG911 GIS program. We have been talking for a long time about trying to find a way to do this training online, and I guess COVID made that a little easier for us. Couple of housekeeping things. I am going to have everyone muted for the course of the call. If you have a question that you would like to put up, please put it in the chat box. Eileen Battles will be monitoring the chat box. So please either put the question to everyone or put it to her. I will try to monitor the chat box, but that won't necessarily mean that I will catch it, especially if we have a little bit of traffic going there. So there are a few points in the presentation where I'll specifically stop and ask for questions, and we will see if anything has come into the chat box and give you an opportunity to ask anything at that point. So we'll see how this works. We'll be flexible with it as we go forward, and hopefully we can make an awesome class for everyone and good recorded training as well for review later. So getting started. We have quite a few topics that we're going to be going over today, but the first one, and really the one that I was most excited to tell you guys about, is that your data is life-saving data. Usually when we start this class, we talk about how NextGen works and kind of the ins and outs and details of things, but there have been a couple of stories recently that have been really specific indicators of some awesome things happening with your data, and I wanted to share those with you. So in Harvey County, they had a caller that had breathing problems and couldn't give their location. The phase 2 cell information, which is the standard location information they can get off of a cell phone, actually failed completely. It was reading on the opposite side of the town from where the man's address was and where what little they could get out of him for location was related to. Eventually, how they located him was using the local GIS data inside Radius Plus, which is a mapping application that I'll be talking about extensively today, and using what's called Rapid SOS, something else I'll be explaining. But that information all provided back to local GIS data for context helps the dispatcher to find this gentleman, and they saved his life. He was able to get to the hospital and get some assistance, and he was truly saved by good GIS data and good GIS functionality. Similarly, Hodgman County was using their local GIS data and Radius Plus's What 3 Words integration, which I'll talk about, to better locate a caller that again was in an emergency, and their address was a lake. It was a large, busy lake area, several square miles of area, and having the local GIS data to be able to get reference information about the various camping spots and the aerial imagery for reference, and What 3 Words, which was coming out of Radius, putting those pieces of information together, the officers were able to find based on what the dispatchers could give out. These are just 2 calls that have happened over the last several months where legitimately without updated GIS data, they could not have located the caller. It isn't just about the ability to find a cell phone, but about the ability to give it context locally that makes sense so instructions can be given to responders to go. And so when you do the work for Next Generation 911, remember that this is where your data is ending up, and this is the kind of thing that may be able to happen with it. So it is very much working data. When your NG911 GIS data is at work, it has 3 functions that it's performing for Next Generation 911. Routing the 911 call, which is the primary one that started sort of this whole process. Information to the call taker and the validation of addresses. I'm going to talk about each of those in just a little bit of detail. So when we talk about routing the 911 call, we're talking about routing the call to the proper public safety answering point, or PSAP. This is a term for a 911 center. Within Next Generation 911, it is your GIS data that is doing this function. Your road and address data turns the address on the call into a coordinate, if that's how the call is currently located. And then the PSAP boundaries provide the actual routing. So whatever coordinate the call is mapped to fits inside a PSAP boundary, and that's how the call is forwarded. When you maintain your data, understanding how it's used is pretty important. And particularly, NextGen 911 is built off of road and address data and the translation of addresses into coordinates. This is one of those functions, but there are a whole lot of others. The next thing that we're going to look at a little bit is information for the call taker. And there are several different ways that the GIS data that you maintain will provide additional information to the call taker. First, and maybe most obviously, the emergency service boundaries will provide some additional information along with the call about who responds or what response area the call is in. But all of the layers that you work on add to Next Generation 911 mapping applications like Radius Plus. And whether the PSAP that you support is on the hosted solution and using Radius Plus, or on some other phone system and using another map, your data layers are still useful in providing that context. But the layers could also be used in other systems, computer-aided dispatch software being the primary one. I get quite a few questions about how you get Next Generation 911 data into certain computer-aided dispatch softwares. And there are a couple I can answer a lot of questions about, and a couple I really can't. But I'm going to encourage you guys to continue bringing those questions forward, because we're doing our best to work with the companies that provide that software to find ways to get the data pushed back and forth as easily as possible. It's not always easy, but there's usually, at the very least, a workaround. Some of the companies are easier to work with than others. But the bottom line is that we want the Next Generation 911 data that you do for call routing, that you do for 911 mapping, to also be able to work in the other applications, and we'll do what we can to assist with that. So the final piece of work that the Next Generation 911 data does is the validation of addresses. And that validation happens for a whole lot of different reasons. Of course, it happens for active 911 calls. That's really the biggie, and it's the reason that we put all this stuff together. But it also validates addresses for new phone lines. So once you put the data in, we'll go through the whole process for the GeoMSAG and how that works. But those new phone line addresses are verified against your data. It's also used for validating addresses in a whole lot of other functions, from various geocoders to simply people being able to use them on a mapping application, making sure that they have a good address, that they understand where that address plots, and that they have related data to it is really important. And one of the things that the data is used for on a regular basis right now is crash reporting. It's something that really wasn't 911 related, because it is crash information sort of after the incident. But the data is not just being used within the 911 center, it's being used related to that, and it's being used broadly within various local governments and state governments. So now that we've talked a little bit about your data at work, I'm going to hit everyone's favorite topic, the GeoMSAG. The GeoMSAG is something that I get an awful lot of questions about, And the way I decided to handle it for this class is to do sort of an FAQ. I have gone through, harvested the questions that I've received either over the phone or email or at various meetings back when we had those in person, and put together the most common questions and the answers to those. Rather than going through a big, long, detailed description of a data translation process, I thought this would be a clearer way to explain what goes on with the GeoMSAG, what it is, and why we have it. So if the question that you have is not hit, please keep it in mind or put it in the chat box so that I can answer it when we get done. But the very first one I get probably the most often is, what is a GeoMSAG? And the GeoMSAG is basically GIS data in a tabular form. It is formatted to accommodate the telephone company database requirements. The MSAG, it was a master street address guide and was basically just a big listing of roads, road names, community names, and address ranges associated with a particular emergency service number. The GeoMSAG is that exact same data, just pulled out of your GIS. So let's take a look at that just a little more closely. And by the way, you may notice that I have a little question up here as an indicator. This is a question I've received once or more often from different maintainers around the state. So if you do get a copy of the slides, you go back through, you'll find that little marker on everything that is a common question I receive. So let's take a look at the anatomy of an MSAG record. For those of you that have gotten into what is called the IUP, and I do not know what IUP stands for, but it is the database that you maintained MSAGs in before GeoMSAGs. For those of you that have gotten in there, this will be familiar. For those of you that haven't, you're still looking at data that you're pretty familiar with. So this is an MSAG record, and I'm going to blow it up a little bit because I know some people are probably working on laptops and have tiny screens. And we are going to, there we go. Take a look at the different pieces of information. So it has a low and a high address range. It has parity. We'll come over here. Unlike ours, which is even, odd, both, or Z for zeros, this is even, odd, or blank. If it is blank, that means both. You have a low range, a high range. You have a pre-directional, if it exists, and everything else related to the street name goes into the street field. You have a community, and this is not necessarily, as we've discussed previously, this is not necessarily the postal community. It isn't even necessarily the incorporated community. It is the MSAG community. And I was speaking with someone not too long ago from a pretty big city in Texas, where because of confusion with MSAG communities, they did away with them altogether. And they literally have community 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. And that's all it says on their MSAG records. And they divided their county into 7 even pieces. And that's what it is. It doesn't matter if you're in the city or out of the city. I'm glad they were able to do that. I wouldn't want to try that myself. It sounds pretty awful, but it is a good illustration of just how disconnected from all of the other definitions of community or city name that we have, this MSAG community can be. So in addition, we have a county number, and it's just an identifier for the county. This gets us in more trouble than it helps us with, and I'll talk about that here in a little bit. You have what is in here called an entity. This is not terribly relevant. You can usually just skip it and not worry about it. You have exchange, also something that you can usually skip, but I will be talking about it just a little bit because, again, it causes us some fuss. And then you have your ESN or emergency service number. On the other side, you have the state. You have an identifier that tells AT&T which of their teams works on it. In this case, it's the Kansas team. You have the MSAG system ID, which this is an indicator of what the addressing authority is for this MSAG. And I was surprised when this was explained to me, because I always thought that was just the 911 center. In Kansas, it is, but that's not how they define it. The idea is that this would be the addressing authority. And when I pointed out in the discussion with the AT&T database team that that's not how addressing authority works in Kansas, the 911 center isn't responsible for addresses throughout a given county, that just seemed to confuse them a little bit. So what you'll see in here for Kansas purposes relates directly to the 911 center that's going to receive that call, but the actual definition is the addressing authority. You'll also maybe see a note, and this is generally not terribly relevant to you, because we were the first switch to the GeoMSAG on a statewide basis. As they did our records, they put the GeoMSAG note in all those little MSAG entries. But as we go forward, you may find those not being in there. It's not something that they're using for searching or whatnot. The other thing I want to hit on this right quick is this last updated and by. And don't have to go into it in a lot of detail, but I want you to understand that this updated date does not come from your data. It comes from the date that this change to the data was processed and implemented into the system. So if you ever get in and look at these, or somebody sends you a screenshot, which has been happening quite a bit, somebody sends you a screenshot of it, and you see that date, don't try to relate it back to your records, or even the date that you submitted it to the coordinating council, because that date is the date it was processed into the GeoMSAG. And the name that is associated with it, the reason I'm pointing that out to you is that it is almost meaningless. Because they're doing their best to automate this process, the person whose name goes in there is often the last person to have made an edit in the database, not the person that was actually handling the automated process that put our data together. So don't bank on that being valuable to you. The date certainly is, but that name might not be. So let's take a look at how your GIS data gets into that data format. So what you have here is a list of 4 GeoMSAG records, and what you have here is a road center line record from my data. So my left from address goes into one of these records, as does my left to. Parity goes over. The pre-directional, the entirety of the street name, the MSAG community left, and if you look right above it, you'll see the other side of the segment, the right side of that segment, and the record that was associated with that. So the MSAG community left. That is what is supposed to happen. It is supposed to grab the ESN and roll all of that data in there. And what I have seen, I can't even put a percentage on it, it would be like 99.9 if I did. Percent of the time this happens, and this happens pretty cleanly. But there are quite a few little rules that we have to get our data to match in order to allow this process to happen on the back end. So I wanted to show you guys how it lines up and kind of give you that as a reference for our discussions going forward. So another question that I get quite a bit about the GeoMSAG is, what about the address points? Today, they turn into road centerline records during the post-submission processing. If you have made the GeoMSAG field equal to yes, we change them into very tiny road centerline records so that they can be processed, because the company we give the data to is not prepared to process address points the way we had hoped. However, we have on very good authority that they will be moved directly into the database in the future, perhaps even in 2021, where your MSAGs will, instead of being big long ranges, will start as address points, and they'll be doing some processing on the back end to see if they should expand those ranges, and they'll be doing all kinds of craziness. But the bottom line is we won't have to do this processing from address point to road center line going forward, because their processing technology on their end is catching up, which is awesome. Another question I get quite a bit is, I uploaded data, how long before it's in the GeoMSAG? And this question usually comes to me because there is a telephone company that is bothering you, and they want to know when that change is going to get in there, and they want to know right now. So the answer to that is that the submissions from us to Intrado, who is the company that processes the data, happen every Tuesday night, or by your request. When we go through the submission process later in the class, I'll show you where to flag if you want us to process your data more quickly than the next Tuesday night. You can always give us a call as well, but we do have a way when you do the submission to indicate that that's necessary. So once our submissions happen, between 3 and 7 days later, which, to give you an idea, is between Friday and the next Wednesday, the change shows up in the GeoMSAG. And I know that's a long time. It's way longer than we wanted, and it is down to approximately 3 to 7 days from up to 14 that we were seeing for a while. And a lot of this has to do with the fact that the phone company is the phone company database. I don't want to pick on AT&T because it's not really their issue, but the database structure that they're working in and the database software that they're working in is older, and it is not flexible. And every time sort of they think they've plugged a hole in the processing, another leak happens somewhere else. So they do a true up, a human eye QA at the end of the automated process, and that can take a little time. And that's where that delay comes in. So if you get a hold of us and you say, hey, I'm putting data up right now, I need you to process it just as soon as you possibly can, we can do it at light speed, and you're still looking at between 3 and 7 days, because that is a period of time we don't have any control over. So the next question that I get, and this is actually maybe the most common question that I get about the GeoMSAG is, it's in my GIS data, why can't the telephone company find it? Well, the most common answer to that question is that they have something wrong in their search. The biggest issue is community most of the time. They are assuming that they should be using one community name, and instead they should be using another. This is particularly common when you're outside city limits, and they're looking for a boundary roughly where they believe the zip code boundary ought to be. They're not, how do I want to say this nicely? They're not practicing searching for as few fields as they need to find their data. They're in a habit. They put in this, 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 and this. And one of the thises that they put in is the community. And if they have the wrong one, they're just not going to get a result in their data back. And that has caused a lot of issues. Similarly, we have the county, and we've run into this a couple of times. For some reason, the phone companies particularly have an issue with the border between Wabaunsee and Shawnee County, but that's not the only one where we have this issue. They'll be putting in the county number. If you remember when I was showing you the MSAG record, I said we'll talk about this because it causes more problems than it solves. If people try to restrict their search by county, they're restricting that search by the county that submitted the data, not necessarily the county line, and they don't realize that anymore. So if you have a border road that sits between two counties and one of them is submitting the left side and one of them is submitting the right side, that'll have actually two different county names on there, even if the phone company believes, or even if accurately, if you looked geographically, maybe it wouldn't quite divide up that way. We have some agreements in GIS that, and who maintains what and who's responsible for what, that don't fit telephone companies' idea of their county boundary. So they may be throwing a county number in there, or they may be throwing an exchange. So exchange is a field that is supposed to represent what is called a central office, or the physical office that the copper wire runs out of to provide the dial tone to a particular house or business or whatever else. That's the exchange field. In a practical sense, what the phone companies use it for is to say, is it mine? Because every one of those central offices is only used and run and maintained by a single telephone company. So their idea is, if ABL, which is the exchange for Southwestern Bell's office in Abilene, if ABL is mine, then if I'm looking for a record that is mine, I should put ABL in the exchange and it should come up. And every place in that ABL area should come up. It's something that made sense before we did this, before we went to GeoMSAGs. And some of you I know ran into during the cleanup why it made sense. Because the city of Abilene is actually a good example. There is ABL, which is Southwestern Bell's exchange for their central office, and there's also ABIL. And ABIL belongs to Twin Valley, and Twin Valley has a small central office also in Abilene to serve a rural area that's just kind of north and west of the city. And those two are not discrete areas with a line in the middle of them. This is really similar to zip codes. A zip code and a central office, those aren't actually polygons. Those are lines. In the case of a zip code, they're the lines that the route carrier or the guy on the route actually drives. And in the case of the central office, you're talking about the physical copper wire and how it spreads out from the central office. They can cross over each other. ABL and ABIL do that. They cross over each other. There are a few places when you get just north of the city of Abilene where you have next door to each other in alternation people who have their phone service from Twin Valley or Southwestern Bell. So we decided, because we did not have good geographic boundaries for where these exchanges sat, we decided way back at the beginning of this project that we were not going to put them in there. And AT&T agreed to that. So if you fast forward, and we've created all of these GeoMSAGs, and we've put that data in there, and they didn't have any exchange on them at all because that wasn't in our data. And they ran into some trouble. People were so used to using it that they felt like they needed to put it back in. They may even have had business practices that didn't have anything to do with kind of our side of the house that they needed to put them in for. So they went back in and added them. But what used to happen previous to GeoMSAGs is, if you take, say, 2400 Avenue, which is the place I was talking about where they alternate back and forth, the 800 block of 2400 Avenue existed in our MSAG twice, once with ABL as the exchange and once with ABIL as the exchange. and they were complete duplications. Nothing was different about them except exchange. You can't do that in your GIS data. And the phone company cannot do that. They cannot duplicate my 800 block of 2400 Avenue so that they can give Twin Valley and Southwestern Bell both their version of that block. So that big old long story is why some of the phone companies really trip over exchange, because they're searching for something that they know is in their area, but they're putting their exchange value on it. And either it was never filled in after the GOMSAG conversion, or it was filled in incorrectly, or it was filled in with one of the service providers' exchanges and it didn't happen to be theirs. So all of those options mean if they type exchange in that field when they do the search, they're not going to get search results back sometimes. And that has been really hard to communicate. Of these three issues, I think we're probably going to live with that one the longest. The county one seems to hit just certain phone companies in certain spots, but community and exchange keep coming up over and over again. So if somebody comes to you and says, why isn't this in there? And you go, I don't know, it's in my data. The question that you should ask them is, what exactly are you searching for? Or you can send them my way, which happens quite a bit. And that is my question as well. What exactly are you searching for? Because usually if you just pop those three fields out, you'll find it. That isn't 100% of the time though. The least common answer to that question, but still occasionally the answer, is that the GIS data was not processed appropriately. And I want to give you guys an idea of why that happens. So the very first one is overlaps. If you have an overlap of range information in your data, you fail validation and you don't come in. But when Intrado processes the data, they have a different, and I would argue inappropriate, test for the range. And I have contacted several maintainers privately to say, hey, we have this silliness, so your data isn't getting in. Here's my suggestion of how you change it, but you got to change it. It's not going to make it all the way to the GOMSAG. If you haven't heard from me, then you don't have that problem yet. But basically what has happened in all of these cases is that somebody will have on one side of a segment, say 100 to 198, and on the other side, it goes from 101 to 149. And the next block goes from 151 to 199. And Intrado, for some reason, tests the lowest and the highest number on each segment and checks to see if those overlap. So in that description, or in that example I just gave you, the lowest 100, the highest 198 on this segment, and on the next segment, the lowest is 151 and the highest is 199, and those two things overlap. To me, it is a completely inappropriate test, but they have not yet changed it. And I don't know where on their roadmap it is for them to do so. This happens pretty rarely, and I may be contacting you and saying, hey, we need to get something in there. If you have a piece of GIS data that is not showing up in your GOMSAG, it may be because of an overlap and it didn't get fully processed. We think we found all of them, but you might run into something like that. The next is the auth left and right and the GOMSAG left and right. We have had a couple of times where people have accidentally calced their authoritative left or right as no. And we skip those. Similarly, the GOMSAG left and right, if you GOMSAG equals no by accident, your stuff may not get into the GOMSAG. So keep an eye on those fields because that will keep them from processing. And then the final reason is just plain old human error. When I talked about the import of GeoMSAG information, I talked about the idea that Intrado has sort of an eyes-on process right at the end, and they go through and they check to make sure everything looks okay before they confirm it in the database. And we have, on very rare occasion, just a couple of times in the last 12 months, had them misinterpret something and make a mistake right there, either deleting a record or merging two records. I think one of each has happened. They haven't happened in quite a while, though. I think it's every time they get a new person kind of doing that job. So this is pretty rare, and I'll be communicating directly with you if it happened, but I do want you to know that it is possible for the GIS data to not be processed appropriately, and that if you suspect that has happened, let us know. We'll work with you. We'll work with Intrado and with AT&T, and we'll make sure the stuff gets lined up properly. So now that I have babbled for a good bit of time on GeoMSAG stuff, are there any other questions that anyone has about GeoMSAGs or about how that data processes for the GeoMSAG that I can answer before I move on?
Sherry, this is Eileen. I don't see anything in the chat window at this time, but I have a question, of course. Um, so that whole process of converting to do MSAG, especially when you're talking about it from the AT&T side of the fence, is interesting and confusing. So when they went through that process, and with the example you gave of there could be records duplicated because of different exchanges, how did they decide what exchange to use when they started using the GeoMSAG, if they had more than one?
Well, you're talking about for our GeoMSAGs, right? Not before that.
Right. Yeah. So if they had multiple exchanges to accommodate, different carriers before GeoMSAG, how did they decide what to use when it moved to GeoMSAG?
Well, it's kind of an awkward answer, but I think it's fair for everyone to understand that when we first started this process, we talked a lot about how the technology was maybe moving faster than some people really understood. And unfortunately, one of those groups of people were the database people. And so when they agreed that we would not put exchange information in our road data and this big conversion happened, they didn't keep a copy of the old data. So they didn't know exactly where there had been duplications and where there had not. Now, the data was available for a time after the GeoMSAGs were created, so that it could be rolled back if it was a mistake. But by the time this exchange thing came up, it was decided that that was unnecessary to hold on to. So they would have had to pull it out of a backup archive, and it was decided not to do that. So they kind of guessed. There's an exchange map that is available. KCC maintained it. I hate to say maintains because it hasn't been updated in quite a long time. But there is an exchange map, and literally they were looking with mapping data we provided at that exchange map and trying to edit MSAGs directly. They tried a couple of more automated methods and they didn't work out so well, and where you really see some confusing things in there, like for example, in my county, which is nowhere near Wichita, we had both a City of Wichita exchange and a Mulvane exchange on a couple of our records. So when you see really confusing stuff, that's kind of where that process started. But eventually they ended up doing it by hand, looking at a map, a static map of exchange boundaries and then our GIS data. And it's still a work in process.
Very interesting. That's why I was kind of wondering. That's why that would be one of the problems with doing the search on the exchange. That makes sense.
Yep.
Looks like we had a couple questions. The first one is, can you clarify the GeoMSAG column entry, please? Are you saying our column should not be set to no? So are you talking about address points, Lisa? This is Lisa's question.
Okay.
Must be because I think you talked about that there. She said yes. So talking specifically about address points where GeoMSAG equals yes or no.
So yes, having your GeoMSAG value on your address points set to no by default is appropriate. You will have fewer address points that need to go into the GeoMSAG by themselves than you will ones that are covered by your road center line range. What I was referring to is making sure that you don't grab GeoMSAG left and right on your roads and accidentally edit a whole bunch of them to no. Because that has happened a couple of times where somebody has been, updating a road name or something like that, and accidentally set several road segments to no, and that what happens is they delete out of the GeoMSAG that way, which isn't what you're looking for. So you're fine for address points, but be careful with your roads.
Okay, great. Sounds like that answered Lisa's question. And then Kristen just wanted to point out, which is a good point, that we did get an updated version of the telephone exchange boundaries from KCC in March of this year. We've had some reported from actually the PSAP, some reported boundary or name differences. And we're working with KCC to get that updated, but Wayne Page has since retired from KCC, so we're kind of in limbo getting that updated. So we'll certainly take any feedback you have to try to collect that information to get it updated. Right, and I think that's it for questions on chat, unless anyone has a question they want to ask live. Oh, got another question. Anne asked, where does Google get their addresses from? Sherry, do you want to take that?
Say a whole lot of places, but I'll let Eileen elaborate on that.
Oh, well, sure. So Google, yeah, will take whatever public domain data they can get their hands on and use it. Additionally, I think they have their own, internal GIS sources as well. They do, more recently, they're offering, oh gosh, it's called like, well, I can't remember the exact name, but there's a way that we can, or someone can choose to share their data with Google. They kind of just introduced it about a year ago, where it's more of an easy interactive thing where you can fill out a form about yourself, submit your data, and then there's supposed to be something that allows you to track that data to make sure, to see if they've accepted it, as well as integrated those updates you supplied into their data. I've heard various levels of success with that. I've heard some people submit data and it hasn't gotten integrated. I've heard there's issues with making sure they're getting data from an authoritative source. I've also heard rumors that now they kind of want you to sign some sort of agreement to do so. So I need to look into that a little bit more. I know they would love to have anyone's data that wants to be shared, but there might be some strings attached. So, and I think there's always something about sharing your data, usually with, insert whatever company name you want that's a major carrier like that or a major provider like that. So if we can gather more information to share that with your group, I'll try to do that and get that information out. Does that answer your question, Anne? Are you looking for anything else specific there? Okay. I don't see any other chat at this time.
Okay. So when it comes to a GeoMSAG, there are some maintenance considerations. This really is a maintainer class. JR has a question that I just saw pop up in the chat before I talk about this. He said, is there anything that makes us the authority and keeps someone from going into Google and changing it later? And to my personal experience, I will say no. Google is sort of crowdsourced. They like to get as authoritative as they can, but I believe that I have never heard of anything where they would allow you to somehow be a custodian of that data. Eileen, is that your experience as well?
Correct. And until I recently heard from a national organization that some people had had trouble even being deemed authoritative to submit data. Um, I don't know that they recognize that role or how they do recognize that. So that's one of the things I can kind of dig into to see if some of their policies or data acceptances change based on who's submitting the data.
Okay. Sorry, I was just messing around with one of my controls here and trying to make sure that everything is going the way it should. So like I was saying, I have maintenance considerations that are related to the GeoMSAG. First, when you are editing a road center line, before you reduce a segment range, meaning right now it's 100 to 198 and 101 to 199. Before you just go in and reduce that because you decide to go from theoretical ranges to real ranges, and you're going to drop that down to 100 to 118 and 101 to 121. Check your phone records because there's always a possibility that accurately or inaccurately somebody has put in a phone record that has an address outside of that new range. So check those phone records. And if you don't know how to do that and you need some information about that, then drop me an email and I can pass it along to you, find out who has access in your county to see those records. But that's always a good idea if you're getting ready to reduce segment range substantially. Not split it up, that's fine, but actually take numbers away. And then think about where to divide your MSAG communities and be as consistent as you can. I mean, this is tough. Some people just do it straight across the same rough zip code boundary that they have, and that works for them, and that's awesome. Other people, myself included, have just said, you know what, if you're in a city, it's the city, and if you're not in a city, it's Dickinson County, and that's what you get. That is not popular with the phone company, but if you work with them to get the records updated, it can get done, and I just find it cleaner. But whatever your theory is, even if you go with the one from Texas where you're just dividing your county into chunks, be consistent so that you can communicate with the phone companies that are providing service in your area and provide them with a map or provide them with information about how they might determine what community their phone service is in. And when you change a road name, either because you're correcting it or because of a change at the city or county level or whatever, check for phone company records, telephone records, and communicate with the telephone company that's going to need to change the road name. Because you can make small adjustments to a road name and the system will take it and will adjust those phone records. But if you change, you know, Main Street to Highway 19, those telephone records will become what is known as orphaned. And they won't process that change because it would leave some phone records unable to be routed appropriately. So when you're doing maintenance, other than making sure that you don't accidentally edit those auth and GeoMSAG fields, these are really the things that are going to have the biggest impact on the GeoMSAG and how it works. So our next topic for discussion is rapid deploy. And rapid deploy is something that I know a lot of people have been hearing about. There's a whole lot of different terminology around it, and I've had a lot of questions. So I decided to do this section the same as I did the last one and do it in reference to the frequently asked questions I've had. So the very first question that I get on a regular basis is, Rapid what? Because there's an awful lot of rapid things that are related to 911. These are three that I hear about on a regular basis. There's 911 Rapid Response, which is responder software and CAD software. There is Rapid SOS, and there is Rapid Deploy. So Rapid Response, we can ignore. It doesn't with us, but you may hear about it. Your 911 center may talk about using Rapid Response. It doesn't have anything directly to do with our data, and nobody has talked about trying to move mapping data into it yet. So I just decided we'll pull that off the screen. Then we have Rapid SOS. And what Rapid SOS is a company that is attempting to correct the problems that exist with cellular location. I talked about this a lot in previous classes, and I'm sure a lot of you guys have heard it, but the very, very brief description is right now, what happens when you dial 911 from a cell phone is that the system forwards your call to the 911 center responsible for the cell tower that picked up your call. Then your location, as determined solely by GPS, this matters, is transmitted to the 911 center, and that is called phase 2 or wireless phase 2 location information. The thing is, when you get on your phone and try to find a nearby restaurant or order a pizza or do any number of location related things, Snapchat, anything else, you're not just using GPS. You're using enhanced location services that include the web of wireless signals and in some cases even Bluetooth signals across the country, and Apple and Google both are using those signals and their relative strengths and the time that you've been near them and all this stuff to correct your location, because GPS in your little cell phone can be pretty inaccurate. 911 only uses GPS. That's actually a law, horrifyingly, and it has never been fully dealt with at the federal level. And so what Rapid SOS does is it says, okay, we have better location information. We will offer a service that transmits the improved location information to the 911 center, not with the phone call, but kind of like doing a lookup. So once the call gets to the 911 center, their computer system says, okay, here's the phone number, Rapid SOS, do you have a better location? And Rapid SOS says, why, yes, I do. Here it is. And Rapid SOS makes their money selling sort of ad space. The idea is with Rapid SOS that the 911 center does not pay for this service. Instead, the companies that might want to tack something along with that location, they pay for it. And those types of companies could be alarm companies. They could be probably one of the most obvious is something like Life Alert, or go off of Life Alert and go to something as small as like Fitbit, where you've got recent heartbeat information. It's possible for Rapid SOS to shoot that information into the dispatch center along with the location, and that's something that Fitbit could market. And so it is worth some money to Fitbit to be able to get on that location stream. So Rapid SOS, in short, is a service for getting corrected location information and additional information about a call to the 911 center. But it is just a data service. Rapid Deploy is a software company that provides web-based software to 911 dispatch centers, and inside Rapid Deploy, they have Rapid SOS as a service. Rapid Deploy includes Rapid SOS as a possibility, and they are two different companies. And other than partnership, they're actually not associated at all. So just a lot of rapids out there. But Rapid Deploy is the name of a company. The product is Radius Plus. That is the mapping software that is in the 911 center for all of the 911 centers on the council's hosted phone system. Radius Plus is a web application that plots 911 calls as they're received by the PSAP. That's its job. When they pick up the phone, the map pops to wherever that caller is based on the best information that's available to them at the time. That's its whole job. But that is not all it does. And the reason the council was so excited to get this application is because there are a lot of maps out there, but there are not a lot of maps that also allow pictures and video to be sent to 911 if requested by the dispatcher. Literally, they can send a request, a link in a text to the caller, and the caller can hit a button on their phone and start sending video direct to the 911 center if there's something that needs to be seen. It can handle text messages to 911 callers, and you, I'm sure, have seen some of the announcements that texting 911 is possible. But what you may not know is 911 texting you is not. The text session has to be started by the caller. So they text 911, and that starts a back and forth communication between the 911 center and the person who sent that initial text to 911. But let's say that you tried to call 911 and you lost connection. The dispatcher cannot text you. There's nothing within their system that allows them to do that. It's been a huge hole and a huge problem in 911 for a long time. And Radius Plus has a built-in text function. So even though the person called and is on the phone with you right now, or maybe was on the phone with you and they are now gone, you can send them a text message and begin a text session that way. And I know it seems very simplistic, and a lot of people are kind of shocked that 911 can't do it, but they haven't been able to. Obviously, rapid SOS location and data and other information can come in. That is a pretty big deal. And then to me, as a former dispatcher, the automatic translation of languages is a really big deal as well. I was always very afraid of getting a 911 call from somebody in a language that I did not understand, because even the process of getting a translator on the phone was a little technical. And then when I eventually became an administrator, I realized not just technical, but incredibly expensive and not horrifically reliable. What Radius Plus allows them to do is to write out a message, to type out a message, and then pick the language they want to send it in. And if they receive a text message that is not in English, it automatically translates the language. It does not just use Google Translate. They have a whole translation function built in. And the last time I checked, it was, I think it was 80 languages that that translation worked with. It's pretty amazing stuff. So it's a web application that plots 911 calls as they're received, but it does all this other stuff too that 911 really needed. So what does it look like? This is the Rapid Deploy Radius Plus map. On the screen, when you are zoomed out, you see the emergency service boundaries. These are the law, the fire. We have the mile markers, the highway mile markers from KDOT. We obviously have your GIS data in there quite a bit, but you zoom in a little in order to see more. Address points are there with the house number coming off of the address points when you zoom in. There's parcel boundaries, obviously, but we also have train crossing numbers, which is important when there's an issue with trains to communicate with the railroad with those numbers. And at this point, you start seeing road names a little more clearly. Everything's nicely defined. And then when you zoom all the way in, you actually see ownership information. We'll talk about where all of this stuff comes from. So this is what Radius Plus actually looks like. And I'm going to back up just a bit. Here we go. So when you are zoomed out, obviously you don't see imagery and you don't see the address points. It's because everything within Radius Plus is built as a web map with some additional layers that I'll talk about in a minute. And that web map is set at different zoom levels to show different types of information. This is to make the map as quick as it possibly can be. And we are constantly taking feedback. If someone believes that things need to appear at a different level or need to be symbolized in a different way. But it is one web map for all PSAPs. So it isn't something that can be customized for what you think your data ought to look like or for what your 911 center prefers. Any customization will happen all the way across the board when we do it. So we have to sort of get consensus on things. And we've tried doing a user group meeting at APCO, or the Association of Professional Communications Officers, I believe. We've tried to do a user group there and just didn't get a lot of feedback that way. The way that we have been getting, honestly, the most feedback is the liaison, which is a position with the coordinating council, going to the 911 centers and putting her hands on the map with the dispatchers and having them tell her what they like and don't. And that's really where we've gotten our best information. So let's go through here. The other data that it has available are Esri map services. And what you see here are address points for the non-hosted PSAPs. So those are PSAPs that actually aren't on the hosted solution. Their address points, emergency service boundaries, roads, and utilities are presented separately. And that has to do with permissions to the data and who has it and who doesn't. Similarly, we have the statewide parcel boundaries on there. And I want to talk about those for just a second because I've had a couple of people ask me how to update them. And these are actually the parcel boundaries from ORCA. So the data that's associated with them comes from the appraisal data from Orion in a pull that DASC does from KDOR. So it doesn't come from your appraiser's office one county at a time. It is a big pull from KDOR. So if your data has not been updated, or if a change has been made recently and they have not rebuilt CRS, which is a database the appraisers work with, then you're not going to see some of the newest ownership changes in there. But that is where those parcel boundaries come from. That is where the data comes from. And the parcel data that we used to have people submit through the template geodatabase, that's not the easiest path to get the data. Keeping the ORCA information up to date through the ORCA portal, or PORCA, which I adore Kristen's name for that, is how you keep this data in the map live and up to date. Couple of other things you might notice: they have terrible names for this stuff. They have a layers tab, which is data that Rapid Deploy maintains entirely. It doesn't have anything to do with us. We get to put things in the Esri tab, which of course nobody but us GIS folks even knows what that means. They have a base map tab, which always makes us sad because the map I was showing you a minute ago is a base map by their definition. So if somebody goes into that base map tab and changes to, say, I don't know, Esri's dark data, they actually lose all visual access to the NG911 data. So we have to encourage people to come to the Esri tab to turn things on and off, but to stay away from the base map tab because they could easily lose all their information. So we'd really like to be able to change those names at the top. The weather tab right now is just almost useless because the data that is displayed on it is just not at a granular enough scale to matter to people. But Rapid Deploy is actually working on a partnership with a weather data provider, and they're going to be putting live rain, wind, and all that kind of thing data at a much, much better scale on that weather tab. It's not there now, but that is one of the things that they're in the process of doing. So unfortunately, some of the dispatchers have complained, and I think reasonably, that they go to that weather tab and they turn on wind, something that really matters here in Kansas and can really matter if people want to say burn fields or something, and the data doesn't have a good legend. It isn't, you can't tell the difference between some place that's windy and some place that's not. It's kind of a transparent faded blue field and that kind of thing. But the idea is that there could be a lot of good data there. There's just some polish that needs to happen in a few places. So having described it, unfortunately, one of the questions that I get is Radius Plus breaking a lot? And the answer to that is no. It's been very reliable throughout testing and live use. Some of the PSAPs have a very slow network connection, and it can be slow on that, and it's also a web app, and so occasionally there are caching issues or that kind of thing. But overall, Radius Plus is not breaking. So the next question that I get when I answer that way is, so why do I hear my map isn't working? And the best answer I can give is because the next gen 911 call routing, what's called I3 call routing, and Rapid Deploy were turned on at the same time for most PSAPs. So basically, they gave them a map, and then they changed all the plumbing about the data that gets to the map, everything between the caller and the dispatcher. And so every problem kind of looks like a map problem. And in order to explain that to you, I'm going to explain the basics of 911 call location. As you work with your PSAPs about problems that they're reporting, it's going to be important that you kind of understand this. So the very first step for a 911 call is that the call is made. Somebody dials 911, and that call gets sent into what's called the I3 network, along with some location information. More than 80% of 911 calls have an XY from the wireless carrier or from the device itself. So either there's an XY associated with that GPS I was talking about, or the device is static and has an XY assigned to it, or the wireless carrier is providing an XY. For the remainder of the calls, they come in with an address from the AT&T database. So that's the location information. It gets pushed into the I3 network. The I3 network passes the information, including the location, to the phone software that the dispatchers have. And that software is called Vesta. Then Vesta takes that signal and translates it. And once that translation is finished, it sends the translation on to Radius Plus. And Radius Plus displays the call location it is given. It's important to understand that. You guys have had this happen with your maps before. If the ownership information is bad, it probably isn't the map. it's probably the ownership data. You know, sometimes it is the map, but quite often it's the underlying data, and this is no different. So I want to just kind of, having gone through these 4 steps, just kind of explain to you where this can go wrong. So first of all, the call is made and sent into the I3 network with the location information. The XY can be incorrect. The carrier can be providing the wrong information. The information could not necessarily be wrong, just formatted improperly. And it could just be wildly inaccurate. It could be feet, yards, or miles off. The address information is coming from the AT&T database. And so it is only as accurate as whoever put it in the database. Then the network pushes the location of the call to Vesta, and Vesta has to translate it. So the network could push it formatted improperly, which has happened, and Vesta could translate it improperly, which unfortunately is happening quite a bit. And by the time you get all the way down to Radius Plus, getting the call location, unfortunately what's happening most of the time when people say the map isn't working, it's because Radius Plus was legitimately given no location information. That has happened quite a bit. And it's because of all of the pieces behind it in the network, but the 911 dispatcher, to them, their first indication of a problem is that the map doesn't work. So let me pop through these. I'd forgotten I'd animated it. So when you hear the map isn't working, it is likely because the call is getting to the PSAP with bad information. And what they can see is that the map isn't working. This is a discussion that we have had internally. We've had it with AT&T. We've had it with Rapid Deploy. Unfortunately, Radius Plus is getting a little bit of a bad rap among the PSAPs because it just doesn't work sometimes. And that's not really Rapid Deploy's problem. It's really not a Radius Plus performance issue. It's really about all that plumbing back behind Radius Plus and making sure all that stuff works the way it should. And there's a lot of us working on that, and a lot of time is being spent on it. But as you guys know, if you put something out there and it's got bugs in it, people only have so much patience with it. So when you hear the map isn't working, hopefully you guys have a little bit of an understanding of why. And what we have seen is that other than occasional performance issues at smaller PSAPs with low network connectivity, it's been working really well. And we've been testing with it for well over a year and haven't had any issues when it comes to actually plotting an address or an XY the way it's supposed to and displaying the data appropriately. So soapbox off. The other question I have been getting frequently is, I want to see what they see. They're telling me stuff about this map and I can't see it. So can I get Radius Plus for my office? And so in preparation for this class, I got the answer. And that answer is actually yes, if your PSAP wants you to. Your 911 center is fully in control of the users that are in the system. So they can add you as a user to Radius Plus and give you the URL to get to their Radius Plus. But you won't see imagery yet. And there, I believe, are a couple of other layers that you won't see as well. Eileen, am I right on that?
Correct. You would not see, I think, all the layers that are under the Esri tab, like parcels and the non-hosted data.
And the reason for that is permissions. In order to secure, because of licensing or permissions from the data owners in the case of those layers, but licensing in the case of the imagery, in order to secure it so no one inappropriate could make use of it, we have hidden it behind a firewall, and you have to have the IP address of a known PSAP in order to get through that firewall and get the data. So that does not count for the actual road and address point mapping data for the hosted PSAPs. That information is available for that 911 use inside Rapid Deploy, whether you're behind the firewall or not. But you won't see imagery. We did, as many of you know, we did have another RFP to refresh the statewide imagery. That was successful. We're very proud because it came in. It came in to be flown this flying season coming up, and at a pretty good price, honestly. But also, and most importantly, we will own the data, no licensing restrictions. So we will be able, when we put the data out there, when we put the imagery on Radius Plus, we will no longer have to have that firewall restriction in there. And if you have it at your desk, you'll be able to see the imagery on it at your desk. There will still obviously be some restrictions on the data that's owned by the non-hosted PSAPs. But for the most part, what you're going to want to see, I would think, is your data and the imagery, and that will be available to you. So you can get it. And no, that won't mean you're in the middle of 911 calls. And they can give you a username that doesn't have the right to do anything in the system except search addresses and move around. That would allow you to see stuff. But it is your PSAP's call independently. They have no requirement to share that kind of stuff with you. What we would like to do as time goes forward is to make the web map, like I said, that's based off of a web map, to make a version of the web map available to you to review as well. But that's still something that we're working on and looking at because we're still polishing the web map. I just saw a question pop up. Does the PSAP have to have a separate license established to see a different county? Nope. The PSAP can actually, every PSAP can actually see all of the statewide data. They see every bit of it, and hosted and non-hosted imagery, the whole thing. They slide all over the place. So, are there any other questions related to the mapping application in the PSAPs? I know I threw a whole lot of stuff at you, but I wanted you guys to understand what you might be hearing about the map and how your data gets into it and all that kind of thing. Your submissions get processed into it. You guys hold me to it, Kristen and Eileen, please, but I think it's on a weekly basis. The web map is updated, is that correct?
That is correct. And Kristen, if you want to jump in anytime, please do. But basically, take the submissions, and we found that except for the end of the quarter, about a weekly update seems to be adequate for getting things processed and put into the service that's in the web map. So if you ever see something that needs to be more timely or is more urgent than that, of course, contact us. And we can get that updated. And Kristen put in the chat, yeah, that right now it's a scheduled task on Sunday that updates it weekly to have that done. Let's see, looks like we got another question for Rodney. If ESB boundaries have been aligned and submitted, how do we know lawfare and EMS info is now displaying on 911 map?
Well, if it has been aligned, it's there because it's part of our statewide data set. The alignment was required in order to include it in that statewide data. And what you see on that map is the statewide data layer. So as long as the alignment is complete, it is there. And what they see on that map is also what comes into their 911 center along with the phone call, because it's coming from the same data layer. Does that answer your question?
see, I don't see another response from that. I guess to kind of piggyback on that, so yeah, once the boundaries were aligned, we then submitted them through the whole process that is what generates the GeoMSAGs. So that's what that PSAP should be now be seeing all that information on their map as well as what's coming through for the call.
And just kind of on a side note, when I talked about all the plumbing going wrong sometimes, when that location information is not coming in appropriately, the responder information is often not coming into the 911 center with it either. And it's for those of you that are real tech heads, it's actually coming. It's just being misinterpreted. It's coming in an XML style format called Pitaflow, and it's being misinterpreted, mistranslated by the software somewhere along the line, and they're not entirely certain if that's because of how it's coming in or because of a programming issue inside the phone software, because the examples of where it has messed up are too varied. It's very spotty. It's very difficult to pin down a commonality between the mistakes. All right. So how does all of this affect maintenance? You need to make sure that you are submitting updated addresses for geocoding purposes. That was terribly written. I apologize about that, but nonetheless, submit your NG911 data to get your addresses updated and to correct that geocoding. Anytime that you have new addresses or that kind of thing, Radius Plus is displaying, as Kristen pointed out, the next Sunday we are processing, and you are going to see that data, and so that's how quickly it could come forward. For maintenance, think about that, because that's how you get it in front of the dispatchers. Submit data to Orca to update your parcel boundaries and get the parcel information up to date. I promise you people are looking at it. In my county, we forgot. I say we like it isn't me. I forgot to tell Kristen to change years. And I was shocked at how quickly people started complaining. I mean, it's just 911. In my county, that's only 2 people working at any given time, but they were on it quick when they weren't seeing those ownership names updating the way they needed to. So if you hear about that, this is how you get that information up to date. And then kind of an update on the utility data. Kansas Corporation Commission has utility data, particularly electricity data, statewide. And we were so excited when we found that, and that they were maintaining it, and that they were willing to do maintenance on it. Because when you have a building fire as a dispatcher, the first place that you call other than the fire department is the electric provider, so that the electric provider can come and shut down the electricity and pull the box, pull the meter all the way back, so that the fire department is not in any more danger. And just being able to figure out where the border is between neighboring electrical providers is a pretty big deal, and getting that data has been problematic for 911 centers since, I think, the advent of 911. So the fact that KCC has that, and we're able to put it down statewide, is pretty awesome. It also means that you don't have to worry about putting it together, particularly the electricity information, putting it together and putting it online. That said, we've had a couple of people say, hey, they've got the wrong emergency contact in there. That's not who I should be contacting. And they have been quite willing, they being KCC, has been quite willing to update the data if we have better contact information. So when we get it, when we get that information, we pass it along. We can put you in contact with them. It's just great to have this data, and great that KCC is willing to keep it up to date. And I see that messages have popped up, so I'm gonna scroll back. Thank you, Kristen. So the
Yeah,
question was,
go ahead.
is there a hosted statewide address locator that can be used? And yes, it uses the NG911 address points and red center lines, and then uses older data sources because not everybody has a new updated properly formatted address, and gets updated on a weekly basis. So now that we've talked all about how the data gets used and what it's being used in and what it's doing, let's talk about actually maintaining it. So we have talked frequently about the Kansas NG911 GIS program being designed to create the master GIS repository, which is a shared database for all PSAPs that meets national NG911 standards. And our second goal is to keep that database up to date. And that keep it up to date was always going to be the heavy lift. And you guys have been rock stars. When we talk to people outside of the state of Kansas about our project, sometimes we have to actually show numbers because people don't believe how much participation we get, how frequently people update the data. This last quarter, I believe we had our highest number of counties reporting no changes, and that number was less than 20. We get updated data from nearly every county every quarter, and our 911 system is so much better for it, and the credit for that goes to you guys, because that is a lot of work. It's a pain. It's an add-on to what you do every day, and you should know that we desperately appreciate it. So within the Kansas NG911 program, the coordinating council has several roles. We aggregate, store, and serve out the data. We provide training and outreach related to this program, maintain the data standard, the policies and procedures, in order to keep up with national standards, which I'll talk about here in a sec, and the needs of the project. And then we communicate about everything, or try to. Up until 3 weeks ago, I was one of the co-chairs of NINA's GIS data model, the national data model work group. My county is doing a big renovation project, and the volume of work that I have there kind of got to the point where I had to step down and only be a member of that work group. I couldn't continue to be one of the leaders of it. But I am a member of the work group and working closely with them, and making as strong an argument as I can for keeping any major changes to the data model that would cause us heartburn in Kansas from ending up in there. I can say so far there is no indication that there's going to be anything that gives me any heartburn, or is anything that I feel would have to be passed on to you guys. The next version of the data model, I am hopeful, will happen at the NINA level and hardly make a difference to us at the local level, which is good news. But that's one of the things that we are responsible for, to keep track of those national standards and make sure that we are doing the best that we can to meet them, while still meeting the needs of Kansas PSAPs, and making sure this whole thing kind of rolls together. Within the program, there are 2 local roles. There's the data steward, which is responsible for assuring maintenance is performed on the data and that the updates are reported to the council. And then there's you guys, the data maintainers, which is the primary person or vendor that's performing the actual data maintenance. And the data steward has some requirements. It needs to be an employee of the same entity that's responsible for the PSAP. The data steward is the one that is technically responsible for quarterly reporting. They are responsible for information workflows, which means that the data steward is responsible for getting you the information about new addresses and roads and things like that. And they serve as the single point of contact about the data to the public, meaning any data requests that come out, and the council, meaning any technical questions that come. So it is really best for this to be the PSAP administrator or a supervisor in the PSAP. And the reason for that is that under the new law from a couple of years ago, the PSAP actually faces a fiscal penalty if maintenance is not performed adequately. And the fiscal penalty, just so that you guys are aware, it kind of has is twofold. If the updates are not done in a reasonable frequency, 10% of their funds can be withheld. Their distribution for the fees that are received can be withheld, and most importantly, the council can choose to provide updated data at the expense of the PSAP. So basically, if it looks like the data is not getting maintained because either it is not being submitted or, and this is much less likely, but it's getting submitted but not being updated, then the council does have the authority, after attempting to remediate the situation with the PSAP, they do have the authority to hire a vendor to update the data and charge the PSAP for that update. So because there is a fiscal possibility, a possibility of a fiscal penalty, it's really important for somebody from the PSAP to be involved in this whole data steward, data maintainer process. There are a lot of places where no one from the PSAP is involved in this process, but they are the ones that pay. And if you are from one of those counties where the maintainer and the steward are the same person, and that is you, you should make sure that you're communicating well with the PSAP about any concerns that you have about the frequency of updates or the accuracy of updates or anything like that, because they do have that penalty kind of hanging over them. So the data maintainer maintains the data and assists with or performs the submissions. They either assist with or perform troubleshooting on telephone records and I3 call routing issues. The data maintainer keeps their contact information up on the portal because the maintainer gets a lot more contact through the portal than they do really through any other means. And the maintainer is responsible to keep up with the data model and participate in the process of changing it. I'm going to go through this in some detail through all of these points here in just a little bit because we're going to talk about what it is to be the data maintainer. But before I do that, I am going to give you guys a few minutes to quit staring at the screen and get up and move around. By my computer, it is 2:34, and so I am going to give you guys until 2:45. I will stick around. I will unmute people. We can chat. We can do whatever. But you're welcome to get up and go away. The class will not pick back up until 2:45. So thank you all very much.
So I just want to lay my head down and yes. We're showing pictures in Independence where the trees are weighted down with ice. I think it's some good ice. Yeah, Jody has it on Facebook where she was taking pictures of the land, and then like later on she took another picture and the one was lower. And she took a picture of something open toward her house and a whole big limb was out of it.
Lee has put a question in the box, and I think I am going to ask if either Eileen or Kristen can answer it, because I am kind of a fuddy-duddy about ArcGIS Pro, and Ricky in my office is the only one that messes with it, so I'm not really sure how to answer this one, but I know Kristen has done a lot of work associated with the toolbox and ArcGIS Pro, so she might be able to give some insight here, if she's around.
You in there? Judy Bernine calling.
All right. So it is 2:45, and I'm going to get back going again. We're going to talk about the specifics of what being the data maintainer for Kansas NG911 GIS data actually means. So what it means is that you make any corrections to the data. How you find out that corrections need to get made, that's something that you have to discuss and that you have to kind of figure out. The more people are making use of your data, the more avenues you have for hearing about issues with that data, and the more perspectives you're going to get on the data. So I really encourage you to share that data broadly, to use the same data within multiple applications. We'll talk a little bit about that once we get kind of towards the end of this little section. But making corrections first means finding out that they need to get made. And I encourage you really to consider that, and to plan not only to make the corrections you hear about from 911, but from anywhere else. So your next item is to add any new roads and addresses. So find out about the new roads and addresses that need to go in your data. Make sure that you're in the loop on that information. Adjust any that have changed. Remembering, like I spoke about with the GOMSAG, that if you do change a road name, or you do change the range on a road to reduce the range, that you need to check those TN records and make sure that you're not orphaning a telephone number. You're going to adjust for any emergency response district changes, and the most frequent response district change is because of an annexation. Law enforcement and often fire and EMS as well are heavily controlled by city limit boundary changes. So when those change and all of your response districts change, you're going to have to get that information updated. And then roughly, I skipped over one, back up here. Roughly once a year or so, you're going to need to make data model adjustments in order to meet the standard. Now I say that, but we actually haven't had one for a couple of years now, not a serious adjustment anyway. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. So this also means understanding how data flows in your organization, making sure that, like I said, you're getting road and address information, but also that you know who's looking at the data, that they know how to contact you, that annexations are getting to you, that kind of thing. Communicating within your organization to make sure that you're getting the information that you need. It is technically under our program's design, the data steward's responsibility to get information to you, but you have to be able to make sure that you are an active part of that process. And I highly recommend that you visit the PSAP now and then. If you've never been into a 911 center, they have a lot of them. I don't want to speak for everyone, but a lot of the 911 centers I'm familiar with have sit-alongs. They have an opportunity for you to sit in a position that's behind a dispatcher, be plugged in where you can kind of hear what the dispatcher is dealing with and what they're looking at. But there's no better way to understand how your data is getting used than to take half an hour or an hour and see what job is being done with it. Even at the really slow 911 centers, that's an opportunity of half an hour or an hour to talk to a dispatcher about what they're doing with the data. And just like GIS people, sorry about that, some dispatchers are more informative than others and more helpful than others. But if you've never been there, if you've never seen what they're looking at, it's really critical to get in there. A lot of dispatch centers, I know the one in Dickinson County, and obviously Dickinson County is not one of the tiniest counties, but it's certainly not one of the big ones either. A dispatcher in Dickinson County is looking at 9 monitors at one time. And they are interacting in order to take a phone call and record that information appropriately with 4 of them. If they have to consult the map, they have 2 available to them and they do 2 different jobs. And if they have to consult the map, that goes from 3 monitors they're dealing with to 6. It's a very educational experience to see what a dispatcher is looking at. And you don't have to hear all the gory details of a call or anything like that to get an idea, okay, this is what I need to worry about for clarity. This is what I am putting this data together for. I highly recommend you go. And even if you don't get the opportunity to go, you need to make sure that you're talking to the PSAP regularly. One of the things that we have learned, I always thought it was just kind of a Dickinson County thing, but we have learned it is a statewide thing, is that dispatchers don't complain. I mean, they complain, they complain to each other, but they don't go to you to complain very often, even though maybe something is terribly wrong. So making sure that you're available, that you communicate with the PSAP, that you let them know that you want to hear what they have to say, that you're taking a map to them if you're making a change, and for example, to a fire response boundary or something like that, making sure that line of communication is open is really important. But being the maintainer also means reading the announcements from the portal. We do our best not to send out superfluous announcements. If we send something out, it's because we really thought it was important for people to know it, read about it, participate in it, whatever. So we highly encourage you to look at them. Most of our people have been pretty good at that. By our people, I mean you guys, our GIS folks, but not everyone who gets notifications from the portal has been. So keep it in mind and keep up the good work that way. Being the maintainer also means a few other things. It means prepping the data for submission, of course. It means deciding when extra submissions might be needed because you've just found a big error that you've corrected, or because you've just received a major annexation from a city with a police department in your area, or because you've just put in a big subdivision that you know is already under construction. It could be for a whole lot of reasons that waiting until the end of the quarter is not reasonable or viable given the use of the data. So that's a you thing, deciding when the extra submissions might be needed. You're probably going to perform the submission. To our experience, the maintainer does it for almost everybody. So you also need to be participating in the NG911 process. And I have a good definition of that for you, I think. First and foremost, participating in the process is asking questions. If you ever have questions about the project or about some expectation that you believe is on you, or that some communication we've made that wasn't clear, please ask. We do not get tired of questions. We do not get tired of requests for assistance. We want to be as clear and communicative as we can. We also encourage you to be active, particularly in the public reviews of the data model. There haven't been any for a while, but when the next one comes out, I encourage you, take part. We do our best to give you an update of what pieces of information you need to look at specifically so you don't have to read the whole thing. And read it, take a look, decide whether or not you think it's going to be a big impact to you or that you understand it, and communicate about that. Participating also means sharing your data. Just like the error correction thing that I was talking about earlier, having new perspectives on your data is important. But what's also important is kind of socializing this data format so that you don't end up having to maintain multiple data sets. Sharing the data throughout your organization will start that. And encouraging application vendors to work with the template. I know that there's a whole lot of them that won't pay any attention to that, but we do have people that have made adjustments to the data to get it to work with a variety of applications. So if your vendor won't do it, it's possible that we could put you in touch with somebody who has done it to support it at their county. We're always on the lookout for integrations between the NG911 template and applications for local government so that we can make sure, again, that we're not adding to your workload and doing our best to see that this work gets shared sort of across a variety of apps. And if the application vendor or anyone else has questions, you're welcome to send them our way. I have, in the past year, I have talked to several application vendors. I have talked to address assigners for cities. I have talked to a couple of county commissioners, just answering questions about the expectations of the program and about how the data gets used. And I'm happy to do that. So participating in the process for you means all of these things, not just putting in data, but communicating, helping with the data model, and trying to find ways to spread the data as broadly through your agency as you can. So that's really my definition of what being the data maintainer is. The fact that it takes 4 slides of lists kind of gives you an idea of how big a job it is. And now that we've discussed that set of responsibilities, we also need to discuss the data. Because NG911 GIS data has really 2 functions. Its first function is to geocode addresses, to translate addresses into coordinates. That's its first function. Its second function is to use the coordinate that has been assigned to select a routing polygon so that the call gets to the right 911 center. And trust me when I tell you, there's a lot of people at the national level that say that's the only thing you should worry about the data doing. And I do understand their point of view that first and foremost, that's its job. But the third function that I have down here is the one that actually gives it meat, in my opinion. And that is that NG911 data has to give context to coordinates. If I tell you that I'm at negative 97.5 by 38.4, I haven't told you anything that you're super familiar with. And if I have, then you geek out on coordinates too much. Having that map gives that coordinate, which is the system that all of these processes communicate in for location. It gives that coordinate context to the human being. Nearest streets, nearest addresses, appropriate responders, what county is it in? Is it next to a tree? All of those things. This is data that this data has that purpose. And while the first 2 are really the next gen functions, it's that last one to me that really matters as we're putting the data together, because those first 2 will be handled. We're not allowed to submit data that can't do those first 2 things, but that last one is the one that we really need to have in mind. So in order to do that, we have address points as our first data set we're going to talk about. Address points' job is to store specific address information. And what should be in your address points data is anything and everything that has an assigned street address. As much or as little as you want. There are a couple of counties that have assigned street addresses to everything from playground equipment to bridges to culverts, all kinds of stuff. You're welcome to keep all of that in there. What you have to have is everything that could possibly have a telephone associated with it, because this is 911 data. But you're welcome to keep everything with an assigned street address, and I promise that your dispatchers would really prefer to see all of the assigned addresses, so that if somebody gives them some crazy off-the-wall address, they have an ability to see where it is and what it might be referencing. Because they need to know what it might be referencing, that point should actually be on the thing it refers to. If the address is the address of a house, the point should be on the house. If the address is the address of a piece of playground equipment, should be on that piece of equipment in the best aerial imagery available to you. Again, context. What is the context that we're trying to give the human being about this location? And as always, we recommend 1 point per occupancy, which is 1 point per apartment, 1 point per lot of a trailer court, for example, unit, that kind of thing. We recommend it, but we understand that that is very difficult, expensive data that is not only hard to collect the first time, but really hard to keep up to date, given that people make changes to that kind of thing a lot without notifying you. So have that as a goal. You probably have a pretty good idea where in your area that is important. If you have, for example, a big park or lake where you have several different camp areas and they all have the address of the park, then you know that knowing where those spots are, and if somebody says they're in spot 38, knowing that that's on the east side of the lake rather than the west can be pretty important. It's a lot less important to know if apartment 101 or 102 is the one in the front or the back. But you know that. You may know a building where that matters a whole lot, where you can't get from the front to the back. You've got to know which door to go in. You know your area, you know that data, and you should focus your efforts on fulfilling this recommendation on places where it really matters. We also have road center line data, and the road center lines are required to be all public and addressed private roads, because the point is addresses. So if they have addressed off of this road, you need to have it in there. If you want to include more than that, up to and including even driveways, you are welcome to, but we encourage you to not submit those for our purposes, and you do that by putting a submit equals no on the feature. For all roads, the line direction moves from low to high. That is just because systems that handle geocoding geocode better that way. If you have any exceptions to our topology rules, they have to be listed in the attributes. And address ranges may not overlap using MSAG community. We talked earlier about why that is, but you only have to worry about MSAG community. If you go through and you realize that you have two different MSAG communities in between in a particular area, and they have the same zip code or the same postal community, that is not an issue for validation purposes. It may be an issue for your use or the use of your end users, but we are only looking at MSAG community. The authoritative left and right fields indicate on border roads which side you are responsible for. This allows you to keep the data about the other side of the road without submitting it as though it is authoritative when it is actually your neighbor's data to submit. Now, both of these layers are about addresses. That's their function. And so there's some things to discuss about addresses. First, there's the parsing of them. There are a whole bunch of fields in there, and that is only going to get worse in upcoming versions of the national data model. We have not pushed all of the potential fields down to you, nor are we likely to unless somebody communicates with us that they may have need for one of these weirder fields. But you only have to use the ones you need. And most agencies in the state of Kansas are only going to use the pre-directional, the road name, the suffix type, and the post-directional. And if you aren't sure what to do with a particular piece of road name data, you can always spell it out in the RD field. That's always acceptable. There are three sets of community names in the data. There's the municipality, which is defined as the incorporated municipality. So if it's inside an incorporated city limits, that's the name. And if it is not within an incorporated city limit boundary, unincorporated is the value for that field. Postal community is really not used for next-gen purposes, but strangely, it is still a requirement at the national level. And I can promise you that having already had that discussion about maybe we should consider making that one not required, it was just a meltdown. So a whole lot of people really, really want that data in there as a requirement, and even though it's not used in next gen. So it's going to stay, and it is the community name associated with mail delivery. MSAG community is associated with the MSAG. And as I discussed earlier, that can be the same as postal community or can be a completely different type of data. And I always like to remind everybody that unincorporated community is not spatial reference information. It is not available to dispatchers for anything. It is entirely for interpreting addresses. And as far as we know, there is no one in the state of Kansas that is using unincorporated community to discern address. So for the most part, we can leave that blank. If you believe you might have that situation, then you can always give us a shout and we can kind of talk through it. But right now, there is no extra field in the MSAG to store it, and that means that telephone records can't have an unincorporated community anyway. Now, I've gone over these before if you've attended the class before, but I always think it's important to hit them. Street name pretypes, which are in the data, are not supported by most applications. They're not supported by most computer-aided dispatch applications, and they are not actually supported by our vendor, Intrado, that pushes data into I3 and the GeoMSAG for us. So in Avenue A, technically Avenue is a pre-type. County Road 6, County Road is a pre-type. But we have a recommendation for how you handle it. First of all, if you are going to use something in that pre-type field, it needs to be an abbreviation. So if you need to separate it out, do this. Put AVE in the pre-type field and A in the road field. It is allowable to put AVE A in the road field, but this is really preferred. Be clear. Don't let people get confused or have some concept that maybe you have accidentally put a space in a word or whatever. Spell out the whole thing in the road name field. The same thing goes for County Road. You can put CR6 here, but County Road 6 is probably a better idea for clarity. And just as a quick warning, mapping applications have automatic translation a lot of the time of E to east and to north. So if you happen to have a rural road naming structure that leaves you with an E, an N, or an S, you really need to put those together in one field because this is going to be interpreted as road north. So it's important to concatenate those into a single field if you possibly can. And just kind of as a side note, we concatenate these two on the back end so that we can submit the data to Intrado. If you have anything in that field, we go ahead and put it together into an STP RD field that we add to the data. Emergency service boundaries, or ESBs. These are polygons representing the service areas for your emergency service agencies. They have to fill the council provided boundary with no gaps and no overlaps. That's a requirement for getting them into the I3 system. It has no error tolerance. So, well, that's not entirely true. It has a very, very, very tiny error tolerance that is so tiny, we find that you almost have to have a vertex to vertex match to pass data. So you have to fill the council provided boundary. If you have any issues with the council provided boundary, which most of you have aligned to it already, you can get with your neighbors and come to an agreed upon change and communicate that. But otherwise, you fit with the boundary that we provided. You have to have, in order for the system to work, PSAP, law enforcement, fire, and EMS at a minimum, but it could include other emergency service boundaries like first responders, rescue. We have been working pretty hard with Intrado to get rescue information through the system and displayed on the screen, but there's a whole lot of hurdles to that. And I don't anticipate that we're going to get it done super soon, but we are working on it. Just wanted to let you guys know that. No matter what your emergency service boundary is representing, you need to have it named properly, and that is ESB underscore whatever, law, fire, EMS, and then rescue, and then whatever else you have. We will, should we get permission to submit other ESB data, like say special tactical units as an example, we will come up with an organized name that everybody will need to use for it. And then we have emergency service numbers. I've referred to them a couple of times. They're called ESNs, and they have two jobs in the legacy world, if you will. Before I3, they told the phone company which PSAP should get a phone call, and they also tell the dispatcher which law, fire, and EMS agencies should respond. That was their job. If NG911 fails somehow, if the I3 network fails and cannot figure out where to send a call, AT&T has the ESN as a backup. And what that means is if the I3 network cannot figure out what 911 center it goes to, they will use the ESN that is associated with the MSAG record. So unfortunately, that means we have to continue to keep ESNs in our road and address data, probably for the foreseeable future. Your emergency service zones, or ESZ polygons, are a polygon representation of those emergency service numbers. We are asking you to maintain them, but we do not actually submit them anywhere. It's more about being able to test and verify consistency within the data, and just kind of an illustration of how an ESN works. We have my square county that has one city in it, also a square, because I'm not exactly artistically inclined. The fire department, there are two different fire districts, the east half and the west half. Fire 1, Fire 2. EMS has a north and a south, EMS 1 and EMS 2. And then you have the city. The city has an ESN of 1001 as an example, and then ESN 1002 is the sheriff's department because it's outside the city limits. Fire 1, EMS 1. ESN 1003 is the sheriff's department because we're still outside the city limits. Fire 2, EMS 1, kind of get the idea. 1004 and 1005. That is how ESNs technically work. And if yours are not set up that way somehow and you'd like to make a change to them, just communicate with me. And we can communicate then with AT&T and make sure everything is hunky-dory if you make a big change. But for the most part, I think everybody's lined up pretty well right now, and your only concern is when the square city comes down and annexes something, and you got to go in and change the ESNs associated with that. So that's the data, and we're going to talk about how you submit that data to the portal. So you do that with the NG911 toolbox. The NG911 toolbox has a whole bunch of tools in it. I am not going to go over them in huge detail, but I will be going over them, the ones that you will use and touch on a regular basis. So let's hit the enhancement tools. I don't think a lot of people actually use these on a regular basis, but I kind of think they should. First of all, there are some tools in here that allow you to kind of verify that topology and add it. Make sure you're not missing any rules or anything. There's tools for assigning unique identifiers in here, for calculating your label field. And I will tell you, because I do a lot of messing with the statewide data, that there are some people out there that need to recalculate their labels. Their labels are a bit off from their other road attributes. There is a comparison for road names, which is a great way to find misspellings and things like that. There are tools about address range overlaps and comparing address points, and basically just the ability to go in there and kind of dig around in your data and make sure everything is good. There's the US National Grid Calculator for those of you that might have some use for that, to be able to populate that field and to check your road alias information. So this data set is not required for submission, but it will allow you to get your data into better shape. And I highly recommend that you get in there and play around with some of this. The validation tools, these are the ones that everybody messes with on a regular basis. We have the submission tool, which actually runs number 9, the optional check all required, and then if it passes, zips up the data for submission, does it all kind of whiz bang. It's pretty awesome. Starting at the bottom of the validation tools, this is the tool that you run to make sure that your data is ready to go for submission. The scripts associated with option number 9 are the exact same validation scripts that run on your data when you submit it in the portal. If you pass here, you will pass there. And if you run this tool and you are at an old version, it will tell you so. You need to be on the same version. I have had people ask before if they could use an older toolbox because they could pass that test. That's not how that works, unfortunately. You have to use the most updated version of the toolbox because that's the one that's going to perform the same tests as the portal. But if you are having an issue with the data, or if you are concerned in some way about one specific aspect of the data, you can always come in and run one of these other tests so that you're not waiting through the whole process. You just go, hey, I want to check my boundaries and make sure everything's good with that, so I'm just going to run 4. Again, if you're having any concerns, or you just want to get in there and mess around with your data, or you just know that you have made a lot of changes to address points today or something like that, I encourage you to use these tools. So when you run the validation, the geoprocessing window gives you lots and lots of wonderful information. Of all of the things about the validation set, and I think the scripting in there is just amazing. The information that Kristen puts back to you, to me, is one of the most awesome, because I always feel like I have a good idea of what is happening and the results that came out of that. So fantastic job, Kristen. Thank you. I appreciate that as a maintainer myself. But there are a lot of pieces of information that you get out of all of this. Particularly, I'm going to highlight a couple of things. Sorry about that. That it tests the toolbox version that you're using and makes sure what the most current one is and tells you if things are up to date. It will notify you about issues that you need to look at, but if it's not an issue that stops validation, then your data still passes and still goes forward. So this is the results table. And when you are interpreting the results table, know that entries that begin with an error have to be fixed. Can't do a submission with those in there. And entries that begin with notice are just for your review. They aren't necessarily wrong. They might be, and you need to go in and look at them. So this is a set of errors for my data, and it's telling me that on this particular emergency service boundary layer, on this feature, I left the state field blank. And inside my address points, I have 2 address points with 4972 as an identifier. So I have to go in and find that and change one of those. Then I have a notice that the segment has an address range from high to low instead of low to high. And for me, this is almost always, at least when it is not an error, it is almost always cul-de-sacs. And you will likely get comfortable with the rough number you'll see in your data. Dickinson County, kind of small. I have 1. If I get 2 in there, I know I've made a mistake somewhere. So I've popped these out to make it a little easier for you guys to read. But we have some excellent instructions here. And just kind of as a reminder, this feature ID is the unique identifier for your data. So if you want to join this table back to the data in question, that's the field you do it on. When you do your data submission on the portal, so you've done your validation, you have your validated data ready to go, you come to the portal and say that you have changes, and you go through and you answer the questions about what types of changes that you have. I always like to remind people that you need to mark changes. It doesn't mean that you have to keep track of every single address point that you've made an edit to or anything. But if you don't have changes marked for some of these layers, they're not going to get processed. Processing a statewide data set takes some time. And if you say you don't have any road changes, we're not going to replace your previous road set. So do make sure that you go through and mark the things that have changes. And my big purple circle here is around a note I talked about earlier. If your data submission needs to get into that GOMSAG quick, not wait for our Tuesday submission, but go in quicker than that, then mark yes here, and a notification will go out when you do your submission to catch our attention and get us to do that submission early. A few rules associated with submissions. Your data has to be submitted in the template geodatabase format, and all of it has to be there. That is one of the tests. Even if you only changed the roads, you still need to have all of the data in the data set, or in the, in the geodatabase. The data has to pass validation checks before it'll be accepted, and it has to pass all of them. Again, just because you're worried about the roads, if you have an error in your address points, it is not going to process just the roads. You have to have the whole thing validated. You need to submit changes quarterly at a minimum. And when you go more frequently than quarterly is up to you. Basic recommendation is anytime you have serious corrections, new annexations, or new or changed roads, I recommend that you do an upload. We have people that submit data as frequently as every 2 weeks, and we have lots of people that submit it once a quarter. So that range is there. Understand that, as Kristen said earlier, every Sunday your data is getting presented to the dispatchers. So think about that when you think about your update frequency. And like I said, if you have a major correction or you know there's a major issue, waiting to the end of quarter might be a bad idea. So still, that is a local decision and your call. Once your data is submitted, some stuff happens to it. Particularly, we aggregate it into the statewide data set that I have discussed several times here. Unique identifiers, statewide unique identifiers are added, done by concatenating your steward ID with your unique identifier. We also add some fields like that STP RD field I talked about with the concatenated pre-type and road name. And we do some other acrobatics with the data to accommodate EGDMS, which is the name of the product that Intrado uses, that we submit to Intrado through. I mention this all the time. I don't know how many people have gone and looked at it, but it's a pretty impressive document. We have a full list of all of the post-processing steps at the DASC website under 911 initiatives, standards, tools, and practices. And that document is updated regularly, and a whole host of stuff happens to the data after it comes to us. And I highly, highly encourage you to take a look at it, because it kind of gives you an idea of, one, the import of what you're doing, I think, but also when you see what we're going to be doing with it afterwards, sometimes that helps you make a decision about data maintenance and about something that you're thinking about doing or wondering if it'll be okay. Knowing what's about to happen with the data can be helpful. So my next section is just some general FAQs that I have, things that people have asked me. And so before I move on to that, I'm going to see, are there any questions about data maintenance or data submissions or the toolbox or any of that kind of stuff? This is a different format for class than I have done before, but I feel like this has kind of covered the majority of what we normally do. So if there's anything that I didn't hit or anything that you wanted to hear about, now is your opportunity to hop in chat and say so.
Sherry, I'm
Ken?
not seeing any questions, but I'd just like to reiterate Sherry's point of your participation. It's interesting now that you know, the dispatchers are seeing the data every day for several hours a day. They also help feed the update loop. So appreciate you updating based on their feedback. And we do report these numbers at every 911 Coordinating Council meeting as to our update status. And it's funny, we go through our updates, and most often we're like, well, here's where we're at the update, and you know, 100% participation, and everyone just nods and smiles at us, and that's our update. So it's just lovely to be able to to provide that. So thanks again for all your efforts.
All right. So no one popped any questions in, so I'm going to head on with the FAQs. These are questions that I had that I didn't feel fit in any of our previous categories. So this one comes up a lot. Is the data model changing soon? Not that we know of. We are aware that the phone companies, particularly AT&T, are looking at changing their databases going forward. They're trying to sort of start a process to modernize some of that stuff. And if they do, it might end up requiring a new field or two for us to accommodate that. But we know that will not be until at least Q3 2021 or later. And what we know about it right now is that we will likely handle it on the back end and not even tell you guys about it. But I wanted to bring it up just in case things change and we end up having to add it. And it would be more of a process field, not something you'd worry about too much, but trying to put a PSAP name on maybe each side of a segment. But I think it's something we can handle, like I said, ourselves. It's a ways off, but it's really the only change that we are aware of at this point. Are the validation tests changing soon? And yes, but only with one small change. Right now, parity conflicts with address range numbers are notices, and they will become errors. And what I mean by that is that you have a range of 101 to 199 and a parity of E for even. That is a conflict. Similarly, having 101 to 198, so you have an odd number and an even number, but you say the parity is odd only, a conflict. Or having an even parity and the range is 0 to 0. Those need to line up, and we have been notifying you when they don't, but we have not been airing it out. As the database modernization happens, as they handle these script issues with the creation of GeoMSAG entries, and as they look at their databases going forward, they're going to be relying more on this data being accurate, and we're going to have to reject data that doesn't line it up. The good news is very few of these statewide. I contacted fewer than half a dozen data maintainers just about a month ago and said, hey, I need you to clean this up a little bit, because that's all we had. It was just not even a dozen segments, as I recall. So just keep in mind that that may be becoming an error. Again, I don't have a set date for that. Can I add fields? I get this question quite a bit. Can I add fields to the roads? Can I add them to the addresses? A lot of times I get it in context with like a computer-aided dispatch system. The New World system is one that I get a lot of questions about, because New World uses an ID field, a unique identifier field that is an integer. They will not read our field, which by national standard is a text field. Absolutely, you can add it. You can add it, you can calculate it, you can add 100 extra fields if you really, really want to. Same thing with features, like I talked about driveways, or if you want to keep road information about a mile or two into your neighboring county or whatever else. You can keep extra fields, you can keep extra features. The fields are fine. If you keep extra features, we just ask that you make sure that they are submit equals no, because if they're not, then we will test them during validation and we'll error you out on them. And we don't want to do that. So just make submit equal no, and we'll skip over them in the tests. I get this question quite a bit as well. What law requires 911 addressing? There isn't one. The local addressing authority can assign addresses any way they want to. 911 addressing was undertaken statewide, county by county, at the request of AT&T or CenturyLink, actually. That was the impetus to get going on it, because they were trying to get enhanced 911 services, or basically the 911 that you think of, where an address shows up on the dispatcher screen. They were trying to get that done, and they couldn't make MSAGs off of rural routes. And so they often sent the letter, made the request, and the county did it. There is no state law about it. And not every county has a nice, even structured road naming. It's Kansas, and I know it sounds crazy, but some of them even have like curves and stuff. And they have some roads that are a little bit harder to find than a county that's, you know, east to west, A, B, C, D, E, and north, south, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But whatever the local addressing authority decides, they can do. There's not a law saying that they have to do it one way or another. I also get this question: what law requires address numbers to be displayed on properties? Again, there is no state law. There are a couple of cities and at least one county that I'm familiar with that have local ordinances and resolutions that require that. But it is not a state thing. So if you're not aware of anything locally, there's probably nothing local that applies. How do I address whatever? This is another real frequent question, and I'm pointing everyone to the Kansas NG911 addressing guidelines. This is a best practices style document that the GIS committee put together a couple of years ago. It is available on the DASC website under, again, the initiatives and NG911, and it's not a rule. It is just a recommendation. The best we know of. It's built from various addressing standards from Johnson County and Cowley County and Sedgwick County, and the state standard that existed that was done in the, I believe, in the mid 90s late 90s, right in that time frame, and other standards that we found, national standards or standards from other states. So we just kind of distilled that into the best guidance we could give. But as you look at it, and as you look at anything else, understand that there's no official wrong answer. The only thing that is limiting an address assignment is potential liability for confusion, and that is a pretty small potential, and it would have to be really confusing. Address assignment truly is the purview of the city that address is going to be in, or if it's not in an incorporated city, it's the purview of the county. There's not an authority above that. I have a surprising number of these this last year. City X or whatever wants an address off of an unnamed driveway. How do I do that? And so I came up with the best answer I could. Again, this is just a recommendation, but if it's likely to happen again on that same drive, I would consider naming the thing. And what I mean by that is if somebody's private drive, if they're trying to put cabins up there or sort of a mini subdivision, or they say they're going to have all their kids move trailers into it or whatever, then I would consider naming that drive so that you can have a reasonable set of addresses. But if it isn't likely to ever happen again, then my recommendation is imagine driving there. What address could you assign to it that would actually help you find that place? Because from a 911 perspective, a guy in an ambulance who is working in your county because somebody called in sick and he's never driven there before is trying to respond to a heart attack. How does he find it? That's your question. He needs you to address it in such a way that he doesn't have to know your county like the back of his hand. He needs you to address it in such a way that if he's looking at 3 driveways, he at least has some clue which one he's trying to drive down. But that's my best advice. Again, no wrong answers. Just kind of a recommendation, best I can do there. And always I have questions about post office troubles, particularly I've assigned an address and my postmaster doesn't like it, or I've assigned an address and the post office is using a different one, whatever. The USPS address management is a division of the Postal Service, and your postmaster is not a member. Address management understands that you are the authority, you being the city or county are the authority about addresses. So if you are having trouble, this is not a tattletale line, it is a person that can help you get the database cleaned up and get the right thing in there. And I gave her a call just, I want to say at the end of last year, but I haven't talked to her this year. So I'm hoping she's still there and that I'm giving you guys good information, but it's the most updated stuff that I know. That's still the appropriate office to deal with for most of the state, though. And that is it for my frequently asked questions. So are there any other questions, anything that you were hoping I was going to hit that I did not? You're welcome to put it in chat if you did. I am not seeing anything pop up, so I am going to move on, but if you are just typing and I am rushing you, feel free to continue typing and I'll keep an eye on that box. I'm going to sum things up here a little bit because maintenance is necessary. Ongoing maintenance is absolutely necessary to Next Gen 911. If you remember back at the very beginning of the class, 2 hours and change ago, I explained to you a couple of situations that have happened where GIS data truly did save lives just recently and in Kansas. And understand that this is not an issue of convenience, it is life safety, and your data is being used to help people every day. And while the council is supporting it, it is fueled by you. You are the engine that keeps all of this stuff going. I ask that you keep your contact information, please, up to date on the portal. That is how we communicate with you as often as possible. And if you need anything, help, a second opinion, somebody to holler at, whatever, give us a call. We are here and we want to help you out. So I don't see any questions that have popped up in chat. So I'm going to put this up on the screen. These are the websites that you need to know as a data maintainer: the Coordinating Council's portal, where you do submissions, the DASC page, where you can find all of our NG911 information, and then the Coordinating Council page, where you can get information about what the council is doing. And I am going to turn it over as soon as I can find him to Lee Allen. Let me unmute you, who asked to speak. So I think you're good, Lee.
All right. Well, one lucky person is going to get highly rewarded for listening to